Be excluded, you can always mute yourself. Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, I know, that's the side I was going in.
Very much. Let me open up. So last week we started talking about the gut, and last week I was talking more about digestion. So it was in the upper part of the digestive tract where we absorb nutrients from food. But this week I wanted to move on sort of to the lower gut, to the large intestine, to talk about the microbiome, which is, you know, just an exploding area of research. Well, I've been saying it's an exploding area of research for about the last 5 years, but it just research into the gut microbiome continues to grow exponentially, I should say. And there are some very particular links with arthritis, and it's also a good area that really we can influence through diet and through lifestyle. So today is all about that. So I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then I've got a video clip to show you to do a food demonstration, because I didn't trust myself to do that live. So I'll pause at some stage and play a video, which hopefully will turn out okay. But first, a bit of background, just to remind you of what I said last week, that Hippocrates, who is called the father of modern medicine, or certainly modern Western medicine, lived around 400 BC and apparently declared that all disease begins in the gut, which he must have seen from his clinical observations of his patients. But we now know through science that, as I said, gut health is linked to just about every chronic disease, going from cardiovascular health to mental health to cancer, diabetes, and to arthritis as well. So these things might seem very disparate parts of the body. So we're used, when we go into the medical system, the conventional medical system, that we're sort of packaged up into areas of our body. So a rheumatologist might not speak to a gastroenterologist, might not speak to an endocrinologist. You know, our illnesses are sort of packaged up and compartmentalized and given to specialists. But actually, we are complete bodies as a whole, and every part of us really links up with the gut, and there's research linking the gut to just about every other part of the body, or every other body system. So again, just a reminder of what we're talking about last week. This is the human digestive system, really starting in the mouth, going down the esophagus into the stomach, which is this sort of orange kidney bean shaped thing. And last week we spoke about the stomach, and we spoke about the big orange squiggle here, which is the small intestine. Today we're going to talk about the large intestine, which is shown in green and in purple. So the large intestine goes up the right hand side of your abdomen, across the top, and down the left hand side to the rectum and the anus. So this is the area that we're going to be talking about today. And when we talk about the gut microbiome, we're talking really about all the microbes that live in this large intestine. And there are, you know, billions of them. So that's really the world that we're going to explore today. And I would encourage you to think about it like a world, almost like another ecosystem, another planet, really, because it may be inside us, but there really is a lot going on. And yeah, an ecosystem is a good way to think about it. Sometimes I use the analogy of a rainforest or a garden, just to try and convey the notion that there are lots of different species of flora growing there, taking up space, competing for space with each other. So we actually have 10 times as many microbial cells in our gut as we do human cells in our body. But of course, these are bacterial cells and fungi, etc. They're very much smaller than our own cells. So whilst this figure is amazing and incredible when you think that there are more bacteria in us in a way than we have human cells, you know, they are very small, so they don't take up 10 times as much weight or anything like that. This, if you haven't thought about this much before, it might seem a bit icky or a bit thinking of all these microbes inside us, but and for a while, I suppose, in the it's a very scientific era of the 60s and the 70s. Maybe when we were trying to keep everything clean and sterile, maybe that would have felt a bit really yucky that there were so many bugs inside us. But actually, we have evolved with our microbes, and they impact our health mostly in a really good way. So sometimes when researchers are doing research into the gut microbiome, they of course do animal experiments and may experiment a lot on mice. And quite often what they do is that they breed mice in sterile conditions without a gut microbiome and look at how that impacts their health. So you might think that without any bacteria, germs, if you like, in their gut microbiome, that they would be healthier, but actually in most cases their health is very severely impaired. So most of what our gut microbiome does is for our health, or at least neutral. It's only really when things start to go wrong that the gut microbiome is linked to disease. Normally it's there to protect us, to support our immunity, to support our overall health. So there's nothing to feel a little bit creepy about. It would be worse if we didn't have a gut microbiome. Every person sort of has their own unique microbiome fingerprint, if you like, which is established early in life. And your early life experiences, and particularly within the first 1,000 days of life from conception, so that's up until you're, about 2 and a bit, 2.5, those days, that time period is really key in the development of your own unique microbiome. And if things go well in that 1,000-day period in terms of what's good for the microbiome, that can sort of set you up for life in a way. If you have a lot of adverse events during that time in terms of the gut microbiome, it can be rather more difficult to overcome those effects later in life. So what I'm saying is those days are particularly influential, and you have to work harder later on in life to overcome what happens then. So what could adversely affect it? Well, for instance, being born via normal delivery is better for your microbiome than it is to be delivered via cesarean, because you pick up microbes from your mother during the birth process. Being breastfed is better than being bottle fed, with the slight proviso that if your mother has a very poor microbiome, that might be passed on in breast milk. But a lot of the mother's microbiome is passed on in a beneficial way in breast milk. Having a lot of antibiotics, particularly the earlier on in life, can adversely affect the gut microbiome. And then there's some evidence around too much cleanliness having an adverse effect, actually, because our microbiome, we've evolved to expect that we will pick up bugs from playing around in the dirt or outside or with animals or with other kids, and some of those bugs will colonize our young developing guts. So children who grow up on farms tend to have more robust gut microbiomes. Children who grow up with pets, children who grow up with older siblings who stick their sticky fingers into their baby brother or sister's mouths, etc. That's all good. That's normal and good for the gut microbiome. If you're brought up as an only child or an eldest child in a very clean condition without any pets, without playing around in the dirt, that actually has now been found to have an adverse effect on the gut microbiome. So you can see how, depending on the combination of those things that you had or didn't have, how it might influence your gut microbiome. And whilst that's that's like a baseline for your microbial identity through your life, and other things that you can do influence your gut microbiome on top of that, but it's much harder to completely change your baseline, as it were. So it's like, but having said that, you can influence your microbiome within those constraints with diet in only a few days. So studies that have looked at people going from quite a processed sorry, the other way around, from a traditional sort of diet that's quite rich in fruit and vegetables, pulses, lots of fiber, going to a traditional Western diet that has very little fiber and has quite a different effect on the gut microbiome. They found that changes, quite significant changes in the gut microbiome within just a few days. So we have a sort of baseline, and it's hard to completely change that, but you can still make significant differences. And of course, the more of those disadvantageous conditions you had when you were young, the more it's worth really making the effort to make sure that your diet doesn't make your microbiome any worse when you're older. So why we're talking about this in particular links to arthritis, I just talk through a few points because you might be bewildered as to what the link is at all. Well, generally, patients with rheumatoid arthritis have been found to have what's called dysbiotic gut microbiomes. When I say dysbiosis or dysbiotic, it means that they're out of balance really compared to what we see in healthy populations, so people with what's regarded as healthy gut microbiomes. So dysbiotic is a fairly general term to refer to imbalance. It doesn't really mean that there's a particular infection going on, as there would be, say, in gastroenteritis or something, but it's just not the normal healthy balance. Interestingly, and I sort of got a bit drawn into the research while preparing this, patients with rheumatoid arthritis also have a dysbiotic oral microbiome, so the bacteria that are found in the mouth and the oral cavity, and that's been known for quite a long time. And just thinking that that's probably warrants a separate talk in itself about food for the oral microbiome and the links between the oral microbiome and arthritis. But as I say, that's been known for a couple of 100 years actually, and it's yeah, really quite interesting. In the guts of people with rheumatoid arthritis, so this imbalanced gut flora, what's interesting about the gut microbiome is that the bacteria that are in there really control levels of inflammation throughout the body. So they signal to each other, these microbes, and they signal to cells of the immune system. So they can either signal to the immune system to really be very active and attack lots of toxins, or else they can signal that there's no threat and that everything's calm. So when you think of autoimmune types of arthritis, this is where the immune system is overreacting. A lot of that has been found to be driven by the signals given out by the gut microbiome, and the signals depend on what kind of species are in the gut. So in rheumatoid arthritis, there's quite an inflammatory gut microbiome that are sending out signals to get the immune system revved up and activated. In psoriatic arthritis, again, there's a distinct inflammatory, unbalanced microbiome that has been found. And there's one of the things that's going on in psoriasis and then in psoriatic arthritis is that a lot of these inflammatory molecules from the gut can then get through into the bloodstream, is the theory. And I'll show you more about that in a minute on the next slide to sort of explain how that happens. Other types of arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, is particularly linked and has been linked in the research for a long time to a particular gut bacteria called Klebsiella. So there are various research links between having an overgrowth of this particular bug in your gut and developing ankylosing spondylitis. So that's one example of a particular bacteria that triggers the immune system. Again, I'll explain that next. Some bacteria also form what's called biofilms around them. A bacteria can hang out in colonies, and in order to protect themselves from the immune system, they build a sort of a film around them, really, a protective enclosure, so that the immune system can't get at them so much. But so these films keep the bacterial overgrowth safe, but they also in themselves can be a target, can trigger the immune system. The immune system sort of recognizes that something's up and starts to overreact to try and attack the biofilm. In non-immune autoimmune arthritis like osteoarthritis, the gut microbiome heavily influences body weight, which would be particularly important in the inflammation on, say, knee joints, hip joints. So there are various classes of bacteria that make you more prone to extract more calories from food, for instance. Again, there are some of those bacteria that increase inflammation, which make people tend to retain weight or make it hard to lose weight. And the last point linking arthritis to the gut microbiome that I wanted to mention is how we respond to medications or any kind of conventional medical treatment can be influenced by our gut microbiome. And one of the ways that the disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs work or seem to work is that some of them can restore a healthy gut microbiome. So if you give something like methotrexate or sulfasalazine to someone with a dysbiotic gut, one of the ways in which these drugs seem to act is by having an unintended, really, but an antibacterial sort of action where it can modify the gut microbiome. And that could be part of the way that it's working, because in studies when these drugs have modified the gut microbiome and pushed it back towards a healthy balance, that tends to be associated with a decrease in symptoms. So is it part of the way the drugs work? It seems to be part and parcel of it. But the bit about the gut microbiome affects response to medications as well. So sulfasalazine needs to be broken apart by enzymes released by microbes in the gut in order for it to work. In ankylosing spondylitis, patients who have a more resilient microbiome, so more stable and secure, they respond better to anti-TNF inhibiting medication. So it can influence who responds to what treatment. So good idea to try and keep a healthy gut microbiome. I wanted to talk about how the link between the gut microbiome and autoimmunity. So the diagram below is in two parts. On the left-hand side, we have a healthy gut. So above the diagram, up here where it says healthy tight junctions, this zone at the top would be the tube that is your gut. So it's inside the tube of the gut. And then we have these white egg-shaped things with red dots in the middle. That's the single layer of cells that form the barrier between what's inside our gut and our bloodstream. And then here underneath, the pink portion is the bloodstream. Normally, these cells, the white cells that line our gut, they are really tightly joined together, like bricks in a wall joined together with mortar. So it's very difficult for anything that the body doesn't want to get through this barrier as a nutrient to get through. So you see above here, there are these little black, they look a bit like asterisks or whatever. They're microorganisms or toxins. So we ingest a lot of toxins with our food. These flow through the gut tube. And in an ideal world where we've got these healthy junctions between the cells lining the gut, these microorganisms, these toxins can't get through into our bloodstream. In a less healthy gut, if there's dysbiosis, if the gut microbiome is imbalanced, and for a number of other reasons as well, we can get gaps forming between these adjacent cells that line our gut. So the gut microbiome can normally help maintain these junctions, but if they don't, it means that microorganisms and toxins can get through from our gut into the bloodstream where they're not meant to be. Once they're through into the bloodstream, they're visible to our immune system. Our immune system thinks, those aren't meant to be there. I'd better come in to attack and kill them off and clean up the damage. And there are two theories of how this, at least two theories of how this relates to autoimmunity. One is that one's called molecular mimicry, and that's where the immune system comes in to attack these toxins, and the protein structure of the toxins looks a bit like the protein structure of the joints. So by mistake, the immune system will then start to attack the joints. The other theory is just called the bystander effect, which just means that the immune system starts to overreact generally, and the joints will get caught in the crossfire and sort of just damaged by the general inflammation that's going on. So just to recap on that, because it's quite important, the gut microbiome can influence the health of the lining of the gut. If the health of the lining of the gut is not good because you've got a dysbiotic microbiome, then toxins can get through into the bloodstream, and this causes autoimmunity because the immune system reacts to them. This is, in the literature, this is called intestinal permeability. Sometimes lay people call it leaky gut, just because it's a good image for that, the gaps in the junctions between the cells lining the gut. So this is thought to happen in all autoimmune conditions. So rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, lupus, all sorts of other autoimmune conditions. This is a common feature of them all. And how can we help to reduce that leaky gut? Well, there are various things we can do, but one important step is to try to revert to a healthy gut microbiome, because those bacteria naturally support the health of the gut lining. What's a healthy gut microbiome? We know because the American Gut Project and the Human Gut Project looked at sequencing the gut microbiomes of over 10,000 people, and they found that more diverse microbiomes are generally healthier. So back to my garden or rainforest analogy, you don't want one weed to overgrow the whole floor of the rainforest. You want lots and lots of diversity of species. You don't want any one thing to grow over and stop other species from growing through. We generally need a lot of diversity, a diverse ecosystem. And we can help get a diverse microbiome by eating a lot of different plant foods to provide different foods for all the different bugs in our gut. So the American Gut Project found that eating more than 30 different plant foods every week is associated with a more diverse microbiome. And because of that, because the microbiome is more diverse and more robust, it's also associated with less antibiotic resistance, which is a good thing. The gut microbiomes of traditional peoples eating traditional diets, those peoples that are still left in corners of the world, their microbiomes are very diverse, and they do vary from season to season, which is just an indicator that you can influence your microbiome through diet. So healthy peoples who change their diet throughout the year, depending on the foods that are available, you notice a corresponding fluctuation in their microbiome. If you don't know whether your microbiome is healthy or not, there are various tests that you can do that to inform you of the health of your gut microbiome. So the one on the left is a direct public test that you can buy off the internet called Atlas Biomed, and that requires you to submit a small stool sample, and from that the bacterial composition of your gut is sequenced, and they tell you how diverse it is. They give you information on the species that you may be lacking, or some which are grown more than you would expect, and then a suggested list of foods to eat or perhaps to avoid to positively influence the health of your microbiome and encourage more species to grow. I and other nutritional therapists also often order comprehensive stool tests, which provide a bit more detail about the microbiome as well. And these also provide information on any particular overgrowths that we don't want to happen. So looking at particular pathogenic species linked to things like rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis. We also look at fungi and yeast and other things that can overgrow and cause problems in the gut. So yeah, it is possible to have a good detailed look at your gut microbiome. It's important not to get too hung up on individual species, individual results. If you do that, it's more about the diversity of the ecosystem as a whole, and making sure that it's not just one or two species that are growing at the expense of everything else. So once you look at those results and think that you might need to do some work to increase diversity, or if you just suspect that because of early life experiences or of having antibiotics or medications, or through not having a great diet, if you suspect that you might not have a great gut microbiome, what can you do about it? The first thing you can do is to eat foods that feed the bugs in the gut. And you may have heard of probiotics. That's refers to the actual the good bacteria. Prebiotics is the term that we use for food for the bacteria in our gut. So a prebiotic food is a food that beneficial gut bacteria can metabolize, can eat effectively for the benefit of our health. So this is important because all these gut bacteria, like our plants in the rainforest, they're all struggling for space. They're all struggling to get the space for their roots in the forest floor. And the ones that will thrive are the ones that get fed. Nothing can live without nutrients. The bugs in our gut like eating fiber, which we can't digest. So after we've absorbed all our nutrients that we need from our food, fiber that we can't break down goes down into our gut and provides food for our gut bugs. Different species prefer slightly different types of fiber, just as different animal species prefer different food. Different species of bacteria prefer slightly different fibers, hence the need to eat different plant foods in order to have a diverse gut microbiome. And in terms of fiber generally, the average hunter-gatherer, it's been estimated, used to eat 100 to 150 grams of fiber every day, but many of us in the UK only eat about 15 grams of fiber in a day. So if our gut bugs are needing fiber, we are starving some of them out by not eating enough. So when you sit down to eat, you can think, what do I need to nourish myself? But then what am I eating in this meal that's going to nourish my gut bugs? Because they are also heavily influencing my health. So it's this beneficial both ways relationship that we have. We feed our gut bugs and they influence our health in a good way. Particular fibers that they like whole grains, so things like brown rice, jumbo oats, the quinoa, whole wheat. The fiber is in the husk of grains, so whole grains helps them. Legumes, so beans, chickpeas, lentils provide a lot of fiber for them. And then I've listed a few fruits and vegetables that have fiber that's particularly helpful as a prebiotic. So Brussels sprouts, for example. I mean, and these sometimes are foods that can cause some people to be a bit gassy, but that can be sometimes a temporary effect until your gut gets used to it, because the gassiness can be due to your gut bugs fermenting that fiber and producing gas as a byproduct. Some people have lasting sort of gassiness or discomfort with some prebiotic foods, and that's sort of a special case that they need a bit of help with their gut function. But for many of us, we will get used to these foods. If we increase them in our diet, it just means that we have to do it gradually so that we don't experience too much discomfort. So increase the amount you eat gradually. Another way you can feed your gut microbiome with prebiotics is that if you take starchy foods, cook them, cool them, reheat them again, some of the starch, some of the carbohydrate is turned into what's called resistant starch, which is a fiber that we can't digest, but our gut bugs can. So things like potato salad, cold rice and pasta, even, if you freeze bread and then thaw it and toast it and cool it, you theoretically at least get rid of some of the starch. And I mentioned about increasing slowly. Another group of foods that work sort of in tandem with the prebiotics are foods called polyphenols. This is a compound found in plant foods, and I'll probably run out of time to talk about it too much, but these are really brightly colored compounds found in brightly coloured foods, so berries, herbs, spices. There's some polyphenols in red wine, also in cacao or cocoa powder, and these the colour is an indication that you're feeding different species, and these help feed and support the beneficial bacteria in our gut. So thinking of foods that increase that provide nutrients for our gut bugs, a couple of ways to make sure that you're eating enough is to think, how many different coloured plant foods do you eat over the course of a few days? Are you just eating green and maybe orange? Are you also eating purple and red fruits or vegetables, yellow? Can you eat the rainbow? Because that's providing different polyphenols for your gut. And then, as the American Gut Project found, that eating more than 30 plant foods in a week supported a more diverse gut microbiome. If you stopped and thought about how many different plant foods you were eating in a week, would it be more than 30? So each herb and spice would count separately, and different varieties of plants, but things like, brown rice and white rice would be the same. So if you cook with a lot of herbs and spices, that has a double benefit. It provides you with a lot of polyphenols for your gut microbiome. It also increases it's a very easy way to increase the number of plant foods you eat in a week is by including herbs and spices. So it really helps with diversity. Just wanted to quickly move on to mention fermented foods, which are a food form of probiotics. So you may have seen probiotics in yogurts in supermarkets, in other products in supermarkets like kefir, or as capsules in health food shops. Fermented foods are the way that human societies all around the world really have got good bacteria into their food supply. So they contain the good bacteria. They don't actually have a lasting effect on our gut microbiome. So taking probiotics doesn't get that bacteria from the capsule or from the fermented food to go into our gut and to latch on and stay there. It's by eating prebiotics, which we just talked about, that you change your gut microbiome. But what probiotics or fermented foods do is they have this anti-inflammatory effect as they pass through our gut as we eat them. So whilst you're eating them, you're getting the beneficial effect. You're not necessarily getting a lasting effect, but the effect that you're having as you're eating them daily in your diet, if you make these a regular part of your diet, can be quite significant for some people. And why food is interesting is that, if you buy a probiotic capsule, it might contain 4 strains of probiotic bacteria. Fermented foods generally contain many, many more strains than a capsule would do. And they're cheap, much cheaper than buying capsules, and they can be quite fun to make. So you can make probiotic yogurt, you can make kefir at home. Kimchi is a Korean fermented vegetable dish. Kombucha is fermented green tea, and you can get kombucha, kimchi sometimes, and definitely kefir in supermarkets now. Sauerkraut is my favorite because it's just a couple of ingredients. It's very, very cheap to make, but it's difficult to find in supermarkets. At least traditionally fermented sauerkraut is very difficult to find in supermarkets, and it does need to be traditionally fermented and not pickled. So you sometimes find sauerkraut in supermarkets and it's in vinegar. That's no good. That means it's pickled. It's not fermented in a way that increases the bacteria. So what I'd done at Diane's request is record a little video with my son's help, piecing it together, of how to make sauerkraut. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides and sit back and have a rest I'm going to sit back and have a rest as I share my video. Hopefully this will work, of me making sauerkraut. So here we go. Hello, I'm Joan Faria of Empowered Nutrition, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make one of the easiest of all fermented foods to make at home, and that's sauerkraut. So let's start off by saying what you need to have ready in order to make sauerkraut. And of course, you need a cabbage. This is like a small to medium size pointed cabbage, but you can use any type of cabbage, be it Savoy, green, white, red cabbage is particularly nice in sauerkraut. Medium-ish size cabbage of your choice. You'll need to have a 500 milliliter capacity Kilner jar or some kind of clip top jar, which you need to sterilize before starting the process. I'll cover that in a moment. We need some sea salt. Ideally, I've got some pink Himalayan salt. You can use other sea salt if you wish. I've got a large mixing bowl in which to mix up the salt and cabbage. I use my food processor to finely shred the cabbage, but you don't need a food processor. You can shred the cabbage manually with a sharp knife, but I find it quicker and easier to use my food processor. And a chopping board and a sharp knife. I'm going to start off by sterilising the Kilner jar. We do this because the fermentation process is designed to encourage the growth of beneficial bacteria that are naturally present on the cabbage. So it encourages the growth of those bacteria, but what we don't want is for any pathogenic bacteria, which might naturally be around the jar, to be encouraged to grow or to overgrow during the same process. So it's really important to start with a sterile jar. As I said, this is a 500 milliliter capacity Kilner jar. I've already washed it in soapy normal dishwater. And it's important just to have a quick check of the jar to make sure that there aren't any cracks or areas of damage that would also harbour bacteria, and discard the jar if there are any. So we need to sterilise both the jar and the rubber seal. So I'm just going to take the rubber seal off and we'll sterilise them separately, but in the same process. And then I'm going to place both the jar and the seal into a pan of cold water, but enough cold water to completely cover the jar. So I'll put the seal in first and then the jar into the pan of cold water, making sure that it fills up the jar. And then I'm just going to turn the heat on to bring the water to the boil. And once it's boiling, I'll keep it boiling for 10 minutes. That's enough to sterilise the jar. I don't put the jar straight into the pan of boiling water because that can crack the jar. So put it in cold and bring the temperature up gradually and you shouldn't get any cracks. Once that process has happened and you've boiled for 10 minutes, you can lift the jar out carefully with a pair of tongs, or wait until the water is cool enough so that you can lift it out with your hands, whichever you prefer. So I'll be back once the jar is sterilised. Okay, so I have sterilised my jar. It's just cooling a little bit and I'm ready to prepare the cabbage now. So I have washed this cabbage, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off the outer leaf and I'm going to keep it to one side and not use it. You can keep one leaf or two leaves depending on how well it comes off. But basically you need enough leaf left over that's going to cover the top of the jar once you're finished. That will become clear as we go on. So I am going to start then by taking a sharp knife and quartering the cabbage lengthways. Oops. So cutting through the core of the cabbage. And then I'm actually going to, you can see the core there at the bottom of the cabbage. I'm actually going to cut away and keep the cores as well. And again, the reason for that will become clear later on. So there's the cores and the leaf kept to one side. Now, if you were going to shred your cabbage by hand, you would start very finely chopping these quarters. I am actually going to shred the cabbage in my food processor because that's much quicker for me. So let me just, I need to cut it into
sizes that will fit into the food processor. So I just need to make that a little bit smaller so that it will fit through the feeder tube of the food processor. That should do it. Now, let me put that to one side for a moment and move the food processor. Okay, so this is a very old food processor, but it's got a grater attachment on the top, and that spins and is going to shred my cabbage for me. So I'm just going to feed it in bit by bit and shred it. And I'm going to continue that until all the cabbage is shredded. So all my cabbage is now shredded, and I am going to transfer it to a bowl in order to mix in salt. So let me get my mixing bowl, and I'm just going to add in all the cabbage. There's always some stuck around the top. Need a nice big bowl so that we can really get at all the cabbage. So I don't know if you can see, but it's quite finely shredded. And now we need to add salt to the cabbage. Now this is because adding salt to it is going to draw out lots of moisture. So for that size of cabbage and for a 500 milliliter Kilner jar, you need about a tablespoon of sea salt. So I'm going to add that in, sprinkle it into the bowl. Okay, and then with clean hands, I'm going to massage the cabbage. Now, if you can't do this, if you have arthritis in your hands, what you can do instead is you can use the end of the pusher from the food processor, or you could use the end of a rolling pin or anything else clean and with a flat end, and you can sort of start pummeling the cabbage and the salt until water starts to come out of the cabbage. The salt draws the water out of the cabbage. Now this will take a little while if you're pummeling it with a pusher, but I am going to really get stuck in here and give the cabbage a good old squeeze and a massage. Now this takes quite some time. The longer you do it for, the more liquid comes out, and really ideally you want to see a layer of liquid at the bottom of the mixing bowl. But if you don't do it for longer, you'll just get a drier sauerkraut. But I think it is better, tangier, and it's a sort of more moist condiment in the end. So if you massage it for longer. So if I just lift some and squeeze it, even if you can't see, you can probably hear the liquid. Just that's liquid dripping out, not bits of cabbage. You can hear it dripping out. I'm still going, but yeah, it's getting really, really liquidy. And if I show you the bowl, you can see that there's liquid lying at the bottom of the bowl that's come out from the cabbage. So that is just the salt drawing out water that's naturally in the cabbage, drawing it out by osmosis. And we do need some of that liquid to stop the cabbage from going off as it's fermenting, which I will explain in a moment. So I think that's probably enough. I'm going to get the rest of the cabbage as much as possible off my hands and back into the bowl, and then we're going to start thinking about transferring the cabbage into the jar. So we're looking at this from above now, and I have massaged all the cabbage and I've got quite a bit of liquid down in the bottom of the bowl. And now I'm going to start spooning the salty watery cabbage mix, which is quite mushy really, into the sterilised jar. So what I'm going to do, we really want to compact the cabbage in at this stage to squeeze even more water out and to fit it all in. So I'm going to put 2 or 3 spoonfuls in, and then you really need to push this down. I'm using the pusher from my food processor. Again, you could use the end of a rolling pin. So I'm just going to push it down nice and compact into the jar. You want to make sure your jar has cooled if you've just sterilised it before you do this, because if the jar is too hot and you're pressing into it like that, again, you could crack it. So every couple of spoons that I put in, every 2 or 3 spoons, I'm just going to press it down, and the water will start to be squeezed out of the cabbage. So just continuing in the same way. And there you can hear a bit of squelching. The water is starting to come up, and as I press down, the water is rising up and the cabbage is becoming submerged, which is what we want. Let's get the last of this cabbage. And I'm just going to pour the briny water in as well. Sorry about all the scraping noises. And oops, some on the side, and push down. That's all the cabbage in there. Now, all the cabbage is in the Kilner jar, but what I want to show you, if I can, is that if you look at the jar from the side, as I press down on the cabbage, I don't know, it's very difficult to show you, but there is, if I tilt it, you can maybe see that there's some liquid sploshing around in there, and as I press down, you can see the liquid rising up and submerging the cabbage, and that is what we want. We want to keep all the cabbage that's going to ferment under the liquid. And there's a trick way to make sure that you do this, and that is why, if you remember, we saved this outer leaf of cabbage right at the beginning. So what I'm going to do is, inside the Kilner jar, there is like a lip. So the jar is wider around here, and then it goes into the neck of the jar. And I'm going to put the cabbage leaf, the outer cabbage leaf, in on top of the shredded cabbage, but underneath the lip around the neck of the jar, so that the cabbage leaf is keeping all the shredded cabbage underneath the water. So there's going to be obviously a big gap between the cabbage leaf and the lid of the jar when I close it, depending on the size of the cabbage and how full your jar is, but you do want to leave enough gap so that you can get this leaf in under the lip of the jar. And then we also saved these the quartered core of the cabbage, and you can use that as a sort of weight to press down on top of this leaf and keep everything submerged under the liquid. You can also get weights for fermentation jars for this purpose. If you had a kitchen weight, you could put that in there on top of the leaf, but I'm just using the core because waste not, want not. And when you press the lid shut and clip it shut, that core, handily enough, is just the right size so that it's held tight between the lid and the leaf, and that's going to keep all the shredded cabbage submerged below the water. And what that does is that it stops, we want the fermentation process to happen without oxygen, so it's keeping all the cabbage underwater, away from the air, so that we don't get pathogenic bacterial growth or fungi or anything. So we now have a jar of sauerkraut that's ready to be left to ferment. So all you do at this point is to keep it in a warmish place and leave it for at least a week. How long it takes to ferment does depend on the temperature, so fermentation will happen more quickly in the summer than in the winter. But at this time of year, you want to leave it for at least a week, maybe 2 weeks. You can open the lid at any time during the fermentation process. So sometimes, particularly if you've got, I mean, my cabbage, as you can see, is not right up to the top of the jar. If you've got more cabbage in your jar than this, and there's quite a lot of material in there, it does give off gas as it ferments. And sometimes if you're in the kitchen and it's quiet, you can hear this jar fizzing a little bit with the pressure of the gases building up. And if that happens, then you can just unclip the jar for a moment or two just to let the pressure escape. It's called burping it. So yeah, you can open the jar at any time during the fermentation process. Because it's just cabbage and salt, it is safe to eat at any time during the fermentation process. So you can open the jar, take the outer leaf off the top, and taste a little bit of the sauerkraut and see whether it's to your taste or not. The longer you leave it, the tangier it will get, and that's the sort of taste you're looking for to show that the beneficial bacteria have grown. You get that really tangy fermented food taste. When it's fermented to your taste, which as I say is at least a week, up to 2 weeks, then you can transfer this jar to the fridge, and it will keep then for months because it has been fermented as a way of preserving it. So once you keep it in the fridge, you stop the fermentation process from happening, but then it has quite a long shelf life. And then I like to enjoy just about no more than a tablespoon really of sauerkraut with a meal. If you haven't had any fermented foods before, then start off slowly enjoying fermented foods. You could just have, half a teaspoon to start with, or a teaspoon to start with. This is because if you're, it's a change for your gut to have these beneficial probiotic bacteria in it. These bacteria can actually kill off less welcome bacteria in your gut, which is a good thing. But if too much of that happens at once, the dying bacteria in your gut do release toxins, and your body has to process this. So you don't want to overload your body with probiotics. So start slowly. You can start, as I say, with just half a teaspoon or so on the side of a plate. I use this just as a sort of garnish or relish, about a tablespoon or so. It's really nice with all kinds of savoury dishes. Yeah, try it with any kind of cabbage that you have to hand, especially with red cabbage in the winter. It is delicious. And yeah, let me know how you get on with it. I'd love to hear. Enjoy your sauerkraut, folks.
Okay, so hopefully that was a fairly comprehensive guide to making sauerkraut that you might be able to do, and be interested to know if anyone does, as I said, or whether anyone has done already, or whether you have other fermented foods.
That's great. Thanks, Jane. Very interesting. I'm afraid we're sort of running out of time today, so I'm going to have to skip the normal question and answers. Perhaps if anybody's got any questions they'd like to ask, they can drop us a line at asnetoffice@gmail.com, and we can pick that up next week, hopefully.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll have to stop for now. And
Thank
thanks
you,
very much.
John.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you
You're
next
welcome.
week.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Excellent.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Excellent. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.